This is Singapore, a global financial hub where the average salary is higher than in the United States, and where every 25th person is a millionaire. It is a place that consistently ranks at the top of the world's best places to live, a city of the future, a symbol of success and prosperity. But just 60 years ago, everything was different. Singapore was once one of the poorest and most desperate places on Earth. It was a tiny island without drinking water, without an army, and without any hope. How did one of the greatest economic miracles in history emerge from this chaos? And is it true that this miracle was bought with dictatorship, fear, and the silencing of everyone who dared to disagree? This is the story of how Singapore became a prosperous dictatorship. The date is August 9th, 1965. On television, the face of then Prime Minister Kuan Yew appears. This is no victory speech. This usually unshakable and tough man is fighting back tears as he announces that Singapore has been forced to leave the Malaysian Federation. For many, this meant the end. For Lee, it was the moment of greatest anxiety in his life. Singapore was in ruins. It wasn't just a political act, it was an existential crisis. Imagine a tiny island, smaller than Prague, without any natural resources. It had to import absolutely everything, including drinking water and even sand for construction. Unemployment was staggering, reaching 14%. Roughly 70% of the population lived in overcrowded, unsanitary slums. Streets were controlled by criminal gangs, and opium dens flourished in the dark alleys. To make matters worse, society was deeply divided. Racial riots between the Chinese majority and the Malay minority were a daily occurrence, threatening to spiral into civil war. Furthermore, the country had no army to defend itself against much larger and not always friendly neighbors like Malaysia and Indonesia. Global experts and journalists predicted that Singapore, as an independent state, would not survive more than a few years. It looked like a mission doomed to failure, a small, insignificant dot on the map that everyone was turning away from. From the perspective of 1965, Singapore's future was hopeless. But one man had a different vision, a vision so radical and uncompromising that it changed the fate of this island forever. That man was the aforementioned Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister, a Cambridge-educated lawyer and a political strategist with an iron will. His determination is perfectly captured by his famous quote, "Even from my sickbed, even if you are lowering me into my grave and I feel that something is going wrong with Singapore, I will get up." Lee knew that in the situation Singapore was in, there was no time for halfway solutions or democratic compromises. He needed swift, drastic, and often brutal change. He began with the biggest problem eating away at society from within: corruption. In the 60s, it was omnipresent. Lee knew that without a clean state apparatus, he could build nothing. Therefore, he strengthened the powers of the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, which reported directly to him and had nearly unlimited power to investigate anyone. He introduced a policy of zero tolerance, and the penalties were draconian: high fines and long prison sentences. To prevent temptation, Lee dramatically increased the salaries of state officials and ministers to levels comparable to managers in the private sector. His logic was simple: if you are well paid, you have no reason to risk everything for a bribe. And it worked. Singapore gradually became one of the least corrupt countries in the world, a reputation it maintains to this day. The second problem was security. How can such a small state survive when surrounded by giants? Lee drew inspiration from a country facing similar threats: Israel. With the help of Israeli advisors, he began building the Singaporean army from scratch. He introduced mandatory military service for all young men. It wasn't just about defense. It was a brilliant lesson in nation building. In the army, Chinese, Malays, and Indians met, learned to live together, and relied on one another. This gradually smoothed over the edges of racial tension. Here's an interesting detail. The Israeli advisors were called Mexicans at the time because Singapore is surrounded by Muslim nations, and they certainly wouldn't have liked knowing their neighbor was cooperating with Israel. The third and greatest task was the economy. Singapore had no resources, no industry, and no domestic market. Lee and his team did the exact opposite of what was popular in the world at the time. While other countries were nationalizing and driving out foreign firms, Singapore decided to become the best possible harbor for them. They literally approached the heads of corporations like Texas Instruments or Shell and offered them something they couldn't get elsewhere in the region: low taxes, an English-speaking workforce, and above all, absolute political stability. The government invested massively in infrastructure and education, and built some of the most modern ports and airports in the world. Slums were demolished and replaced by a massive housing development program, which ensured quality living for the majority of the population. The results were staggering. GDP per capita, which in 1965 was around $500, climbed to nearly $12,000 by 1990. A country on the brink of collapse became one of the Asian tigers within a single generation. It was an economic miracle, but it had its dark side. The absolute stability Lee Kuan Yew offered wasn't free. It was bought with the systematic suppression of any opposition and criticism. Lee was convinced that Western-style democracy was a luxury that developing countries could not afford. Too much freedom, in his view, led to chaos that would destroy Singapore's fragile success. His government did not hesitate to use the toughest methods. A key tool was the Internal Security Act, which allowed for arrest and imprisonment without trial for an indefinitely long period. Notoriously famous was Operation Cold Store in 1963, during which over 100 leftist politicians, unionists, and students were arrested, accused of communist sympathies. Many of them, including Lee's greatest rival, Lim Chin Siong, spent years in prison without trial. This operation practically destroyed the opposition and consolidated the power of Lee's People's Action Party for decades. Between 1968 and 1981, the People's Action Party did not have a single opposition member in parliament. Another weapon was defamation lawsuits. Lee and government officials regularly sued opposition politicians and journalists. These legal battles ruined them financially and forced them into bankruptcy, which prevented them from running in elections. Freedom of speech and the press were drastically restricted. The media was, and to a large extent still is, under heavy state control. Any criticism of the government was considered a threat to national security. This atmosphere led to strong self-censorship. People were simply afraid to speak their minds aloud. But control did not stop at politics. Lee's government embarked on extensive social engineering. The state directed where people lived to ensure racial mixing. Campaigns were run to encourage people to have more, or, conversely, fewer children. Strict laws were introduced against littering on the streets and even against failing to flush public toilets. Most famous was the 1992 law banning the import and sale of chewing gum. Why? Because stuck gum was disrupting the operation of the new subway system. And I'm not joking, you can look this up for yourself. Singapore transformed into a perfectly organized, clean, and safe society, but also into a society where every step of a citizen is monitored and regulated. It became what many call a nanny state. It takes care of you, but at the cost of your personal freedom. Lee Kuan Yew created a system that brought prosperity, but he did it in a way that took away the voice of millions. Is Singapore a shining metropolis or just a perfectly managed dictatorship? The answer is not black and white. Singapore is both. It is an undeniable economic miracle, proof that with a clear vision, long-term planning, and an uncompromising fight against corruption, incredible results can be achieved. At the same time, it is a country where this success was paid for by the limitation of basic rights. The social contract here was built on a simple transaction. Give up part of your freedom, and we will ensure security, stability, and prosperity. And most Singaporeans accepted this deal. By the way, many of the tools and laws mentioned today remain in effect in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is immensely complex. To some, he is a visionary who saved his nation. To others, an autocrat who suppressed freedom. The truth is likely that he was both, a product of his time and extreme circumstances. The story of Singapore thus remains a fascinating and yet cautionary lesson. It shows what is possible when a nation unites for a common goal, but it also asks an uncomfortable question. What price are we willing to pay for prosperity? And is a model that sacrifices freedom on the altar of stability truly sustainable and worth following? That is a question to which there is no easy answer. What is your opinion? Do you consider the Singaporean model inspiring or a cautionary tale? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'll be glad if you subscribe to the Segment channel and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon for the next video. Goodbye.